Okay, thank you, and it's a pleasure to be here in Sao Paulo and at FGV. This paper is joint authored work with my colleague Ron Gilson at Columbia, and also somebody with the name of Edward Fox, who's actually my son. So the paper was motivated by this observation, which is that during the period of the financial crisis, there was a very sharp spike. You can see this is actually a five-fold spike measured by variance in the increase in the volatility of stock prices of individual firms after you'd stripped out the portion of volatility that was due to the fact that the market itself was moving up and down a great deal more than in ordinary times. And that's kind of prompted several questions that we investigated in the paper. First of all, was this a one-off event, or has this happened other times before? Secondly, why did it happen? It seemed odd to us that an event, the financial crisis that made the future of the economy harder to predict, we could see why that would lead to greater volatility for the sort of the market as a whole, but why would we see the same phenomenon after you strip that part out? Some possible explanations, which I will talk about some, and then I will talk very briefly. A fair amount of the paper is on legal implications. I'll just talk about that very briefly, but happy to continue in the Q&A on that. Okay, first of all, has this happened before? Well, when we started doing some research, initially we saw that there was an article by Campbell et al. That looked at the period, I think, from 1962 to 1997, and their main interest had been in whether there was kind of a secular trend or increase or decrease in idiosyncratic risk, this firm-specific part of volatility. But they kind of, as an aside, noted that during each of major recessions in the period of time they were studying, and at the time of the stock market break in October of 1987, that there had been spikes in idiosyncratic risk. We extended the survey period here back to 1926 and up essentially to the present, and here's what we found. Is there a light? Yeah, there we go. All right. Well, what we found was that indeed there were lots of earlier spikes in idiosyncratic risk. There was one at the time of the stock market crash in 1929, huge one in the early years of the very, very severe impact of the Great Depression on the U.S. economy. Again, when a deep recession set in 1937. Then the various events that were identified by Campbell et al. And then we see at the time of the crash after the dot-com boom, a huge spike, and then again the one we had originally observed for the financial crisis. So in essence, we see that this is a persistent phenomenon, that it seems to happen every time there's a major setback in the economy. And also, it's not, although in the most recent crisis it was concentrated in the financial sector, I mean, it was sharpest in the financial sector. In fact, it occurs across all industries. If you take the financial sector out, it's still a four-fold increase. In 58 out of the 60 major industries, the way we divide up the U.S. economy, it more than doubled, and it increased in all of them. So that creates a puzzle. If you think about you know, in an efficient market, what causes share prices to move? It's news. It's news that's relevant to predicting the future cash flows of a company. And you can then think of two kinds of news. One would be news that relates to factors that affect all companies, that relates to kind of the performance of the economy as a whole. And easy to see, I think, why in a period of disturbance that each piece of news about what the future of the economy is going to be could have a bigger impact on price. But the rest of what's moving share price is what we might call firm-specific news. And it's not, you know, there was things that would help you independent of what's going on in the economy. Not obvious what, in that regard, that kind of news, independent of what's happening in the economy as a whole, would suddenly have a bigger influence, let alone a sort of five-fold bigger influence during these kinds of periods. As I say, we would have expected to see a big increase in systematic volatility. What was surprising was the large increase in idiosyncratic volatility, and in fact, the larger part of the total increase by quite a bit in any individual firm's volatility came from these second firm-specific factors rather than what was happening in the market as a whole. So why? And put another way, relative to normal times, why on a day when the market has a good day, because even in a crisis there are plenty of good days as well as bad days, do you have far more big losers than is the case in ordinary times? And why on a given bad day for the market as a whole you'd see far more big winners than in ordinary times? Okay, well, we have a few different possible explanations. One of them is that, in essence, current news becomes more important. If you think about it, share prices reflect investors' predictions of future cash flows based on a large number of bits of information or facts. Some of those have been around a long time, and then what actually moves price are a few more that are brand new. Well, if the pieces of information that are brand new kind of tell you more about what future cash flows are in an unstable situation, then they'll cause price to fluctuate more. In other words, price fluctuations depend on the predictive importance of the new bits of information relative to the historical information that's been part of what has helped people predict future cash flows. Think about it this way. Imagine a barrel that has 200 balls in it, some of them red, some of them green, and you're trying to calculate how many, what the ratio is. You don't know, and you start sampling. So every period you take a ball out, look at the color, then put the ball back in and stir the barrel again. Maybe after 20 of these samples, right, 20 of these periods, you have a pretty good sense of the ratio of the red and green balls. So that when you take that 21st ball out, you know, it may change your sense of the ratio a little bit, but not a whole lot. Then imagine that 100 balls are taken out of this barrel and replaced with 100 other balls that might have a completely different distribution. You don't know, which means that the distribution of the whole barrel is in all likelihood changed significantly, certainly possible. In that case, when you take out the 22nd ball, whether it's red or green, is going to change your estimate of the ratio considerably more. So it's just the underlying idea that the new news is more important than it was before. If you think about an economic crisis, it's a situation where there's going to be, in essence, a rearrangement in the firm. The sort of firms are in, if you think of a bunch of firms in a box, the box has been shaken. There'll be some important structural changes. The relationship between firms in terms of their suppliers, their customers, and so on will be different generally than before. Often financial crises, in fact, are caused by imbalances in the economy that, for example, in the US case, housing and finance sectors have grown too large. But the fallout is always a little hard to predict. Some firms will end up relative to each other better off, some firms worse off, but you're not going to know for a while. So the exact nature and the implications of this change aren't clear, and that may enhance the predictive importance of a new piece of information compared to the old base. So if you think about a, let's say, not fully anticipated quarterly earnings announcement that's off by 10% from what kind of historical patterns have been, if this had happened in normal times, it could be due to kind of random fluke factors. You'd assume you're still operating in the same structure, but it could be due, if it happens in times when there's been structural change, it's more likely that it is in fact due to those structural change, so you'd assign more importance to that information. Second possible explanation relates to quality of management. And our intuition here is that it's easier to manage a company in ordinary times, a little bit more like the company's on autopilot. What's worked before is likely to work again now. But in difficult times, running a company is a little bit more like running a startup. You don't have all that guidance from the past, and it means that particularly talented managers can make a bigger difference than in ordinary times. So that would suggest that quality of management matters more, and even if the flow of information about quality of management is at the same rate as you were getting in ordinary times, and even if the sort of what you find out about the quality of management is from those bits is the same, it has greater significance, and so it's going to affect cash flows more and result in bigger share price changes. We explore a couple of other possible explanations in the paper. I'll just which we find less convincing. I'll just briefly touch on. One is this quote from Warren Buffett that it's only when the tide goes out that those who are swimming naked are revealed. Idea that maybe in hard times we find out which companies were in fact exaggerating their performance through accounting gimmicks or actually somehow borrowing cash from to improve their payouts or whatever in ways that weren't obvious, and that practice has to end when times get tough. But we really see most of the phenomena we've observed is due to kind of on a continuous up and downness, not like one sharp drop that would be more like Enron or something, the fraud is somehow revealed. The other is noise trading, and in some sense, some people have suggested that, but when you think about it, it's usually in tough times that the people who seem to be most responsible for noise trading, which are individual investors, day traders and things, those are the people who kind of desert the market at that point. We engage in some other analysis in the paper. We think each of these may be combined with the other explanations, may have some power, but probably not a lot standing on their own. In terms of legal implications, spend a fair amount of the paper on it. Our time is limited. Let me just try to sum of them the following way. In the U.S., event studies have become a very important instrument in litigation. Event studies are studies to try to determine statistically whether a change in price that happens at the time of, for example, a company announcing what we call a corrective disclosure, saying something that suggests that a statement made in the past was a false statement, whether there is whether there's evidence that that corrective disclosure really had an impact on price, which would suggest that people have been damaged by the original misstatement and that it was a relatively important misstatement. Event studies basically are focused on idiosyncratic risk. And so, in essence, what you do is you strip away the systematic portion of volatility. You then look at the price change at the time of either, if we're talking about false statements, litigation related to false statements at the time of the corrective disclosure, if it was something like insider trading at the time that the company reveals the information that people are accused of having traded on before the announcement. The question at this point then is, well, at the time of that announcement, is the price change larger than the typical ups and downs that we see every day in a company's pricing? And it has to be sharply, considerably bigger for us to reject the hypothesis that the price change was simply due, that we saw accompanying the announcement, was simply due to these other everyday factors rather than the announcement. Well, if you have much bigger, in essence, background noise, it's harder to find that for example, a misstatement, let's say that affected price, in fact affected price, let's say by 5%, much harder to find that. So, for example, in normal times, 4 times out of 5, if a misstatement affected price by 5%, you would see a statistically, that would be accompanied by a statistically significant price change, one that could be seen against this background noise. In other words, the type 2 error rate would be something like 20%. 4 out of 5 times you'd see it. When in the kind of the peak of the financial crisis, that would have dropped, the type 2 error rate would have increased to something like 66%, which means only for what is really an announcement that has a pretty big actual effect on price, only about 1 time in 3 would it be accompanied by a price change that is considered statistically significant. Implications for us then are, in terms of a variety of uses of event studies, that they're much less likely to reveal bad behavior than in ordinary times. And that suggests we need to look to other factors instead. We suggest for institutional reasons that probably public enforcement is more responsible in terms of looking at those other issues than private enforcement is. So it suggests that there's a need for more effort in the public enforcement area during periods of crisis than in ordinary times. Now I'll leave it at that.
Okay, it's a great pleasure to be here and have some comments about Merritt papers. And well, actually the paper brings brand new ideas, and it was really astonishing how some interesting correlations have been made by the authors, and things that seems for us just to be sort of just a kind of a sensitive acknowledgement, but they were very concrete in the paper, and it was very clear for us to understand what was the point of the paper. So based on what has been mentioned, I just would like to make some comments related to some aspects that I think that are very interesting related to the paper, and especially making some observations related to Brazilian reality, of course. Well, the first one is, for me, is pretty much a clear conclusion that law and technology, especially finance, they shall walk together. It's basically impossible nowadays to provide good regulation without a good part of technology or finance or economics or etc. Of course, there is a very clear example here when we're talking about pricing and volatility, and that's the main subject of the paper. But it's possible to realize it in antitrust law as well, what is clear. And it's possible to find it in derivatives as well. It's impossible to think about derivatives regulation without thinking about finance. So in one specific point, law and finance and technology and the other sciences, they mix themselves. It's impossible to actually to define what is the border for each one. And that seems for me very clear in the paper. Because it's a legal paper, but it's based on statistics and finance. The second point is, well, now bringing the subject to Brazilian reality. It's pretty much interesting because, well, the best way to prove the theory that the authors had in the paper was to choose fraud on the market class actions. And it's quite clear, the decision, the choice, because when you're considering fraud in the market, so the change in the levels of prices will disclose what is behind the fraud, if actually this volatility is not a natural one, is not from the regular market, it's not a systematic consequence. Well, the first point is we have a small amount of fraud on the market lawsuits in Brazil, much less than we should have. And this is something that must be studied. We are discussing this in FGV since the beginning of last year, when we introduced this Center for Capital Markets Investigation. But those numbers, those figures are not very precise. We just collected them quickly in order to put here, and they are part of research that is not still ended. But based on my personal research, fraud on the market corresponds to 6% of all capital markets cases, and the council, financial system appeals council that Bruno and I take part of it. So 6% is really a small percentage, and probably part of this strange figure comes from the difficulty to define when fraud actually happened. And typically, analyzing the procedures and the appeal level, it's clear that the technique is not being used to provide this kind of certainty. So authorities fight with evidences and facts and etc., but they don't use tools, powerful tools like the one that is shown in the paper. And this is one research that's been conducted by Professor Viviane that is here. From 2003 to 2013, actually from 2000, because there was nothing between 2000 and 2003. There was just 59 procedures related to insider trading. And, well, insider trading is a little bit different because not always volatility will be decisive in defining if there was or not the crime or the irregularity, because if perhaps you may practice insider trading without changing the price of the asset. So, but we had 59 CVM procedures with 161 agents investigated and just 39 convicted.
What's the population?
Huh?
What's the population of corporations?
500, almost 500. Well, and 39 convicted, and if we consider crime, criminal justice, we have just 2 convictions in all our history, and they were very celebrated, as you can imagine.
Now we have our third in Jao.
Oh, yeah. Now we have the third, so they are in history.
And why do you say this is a small number, just to understand the concept?
What? Why?
Why do you say this is a small number, just to understand your benchmark?
Why is more number? Because if you consider that is a, I would say it's a five. What's the volume of?
5 or 6 years.
Huh? The volume of 8 million? 8 billion reais per day is with a high number of transactions actually, and with some significant problems in information and disclosure. So in many cases, and we are witness of that, and that's why we need more data in order to sustain that. But in our experience, what we feel is that in many cases it is very clear that we have there an insider case or a fraud case, but it's impossible to convict it just based on the facts that are there. So it would be necessary something else. Otherwise, you would be submitted to evidences, sometimes very light evidences. So based on the level of our regulatory authority and the way market is regulated in Brazil, I really think that we should have more than that convictions. Well, there is another point related to the paper that I would like to stress, and it just reinforces the conclusions of the paper. I could find here some graphics related to idiosyncratic risk, Brazilian idiosyncratic risk. And if we take this graphic that is from Angelides, oh, I'm sorry. No, I'm changing my computer and I'm not changing yours. If you take this graphic that goes from 95 to 2006. And this is the idiosyncratic volatility. You have a high peak here, that is Mexico crisis. And after that, a second peak here. Yeah, it is Asian crisis. And then again, another peak here, that is Russia crisis. And after that, the next crisis that we actually had was subprime crisis.
Sorry, just so I understand, that this is idiosyncratic risk of Brazilian equities?
Brazilian equities, yes.
So the blue line is what?
The blue line is typical one, and the second one is a smooth measure made by Kim model.
Okay.
Yeah, it's
Smooth.
but it's basically the same with a smooth methodology. The point is, I couldn't find a graphic for that, but we had an increase in idiosyncratic volatility in Brazil, again, in 2008 to 2009, after subprime. And that's what is surprising, because if we consider the previous crisis, Mexico, Asia, and Russia, the domestic effects of those crises were very clear. It was very easy to realize those effects. So it's clear for us that there would be an increase in idiosyncratic volatility. But in 2009, during subprime, volatility, typical volatility, not idiosyncratic volatility, but volatility increased consistently, and idiosyncratic volatility increased as well. We have a graphic here just showing how volatility increased, and this just reflects the increase of volatility in Brazilian markets. So the point is, this is not our crisis typically, and most of that, more than that, the government mentioned that probably the crisis wouldn't be that big in Brazil. So if the crisis wouldn't be that big in Brazil, the point is, why would idiosyncratic volatility change in Brazil as well? Or should it change in a different way? And another point is, would the globalization of markets just kind of contaminate the different markets? And so we should consider internal crisis, domestic crisis, as well as external crisis, international crisis. Well, those are some points I just brought to you to think about, and well, they were my observations on. There's a lot to talk about text, because text is really very rich, but I just try to choose some specific points in order to bring you some discussion. Thank you.
One of the explanations that you have in the paper that you didn't mention here was kind of, I think, explanation C. So you say, look, there could be updating because a new event results. We know there's more balls in there. The new information matters more. Management quality matters more. But I think in C, you're getting to something different. You're saying, actually, there's uncertainty that we didn't realize existed. So you pull out the different colored ball, and suddenly Knightian uncertainty increases. But I wonder if there's something more than that. And this actually builds on the comments that I think that last slide, looking at what went on in Brazil in terms of idiosyncratic risk increasing here, even when you didn't expect there to be hard domestic effects, I think is incredibly interesting. And again, this might, I think, probably be a different paper, but fleshing out the different explanations, because that suggests that what's going on might be actually something different, where there's a change at the investor side. So investors, rather than rationally updating based on new information, investors recognize on the whole that information matters more. And again, we talked about this before, I think, in terms of liquidity availability changing and potentially changing the constraints that investors are facing. But there's also something different that happens during crisis periods where I think investors suddenly are reawakened once again to the importance of information on the value of different investments. And so it's not that liquidity, as I've discussed with you before, is driving some of the rise in volatility, but rather what's causing the liquidity to dry up might also be causing the increase in idiosyncratic risk, because a lot of what's causing the shortage of liquidity is a greater attention to firm-specific risks and a result of like kind of drawing back. So investors just become more panicky, and they don't just react, they potentially overreact. And so and the fact that you're seeing this in Brazil, that might help explain it. So investors kind of worldwide be like, oh my gosh, there might be risks there we weren't attuned to before. What else doesn't matter? And so you suddenly become much more attuned and also responsive, if not even reactive, which I would suggest goes beyond kind of the rational updating to new information. So investors start to just value information in a kind of qualitatively different way.
Just one observation and one follow-up on your point. I personally, I don't think that when you have 100 corporations in the market, that 6 investigations in a year and 4 convictions is a small number. I think it's a fairly large number.
Six investigations?
Yeah, six a year. Yeah, that's what you have done. And I don't think that's a small number.
No,
I don't think,
yes.
yeah, so I think it's a fair number. But regardless of the question whether, I think the point is relevant regardless of the question whether you can convict someone or not. To be very interesting to see if there was an actual trading, regardless of the question whether it was illegal or not, during those periods of time. And that will shed some light over which of the arguments to pick when you will see just the actual trading, regardless of the question whether there was investigation or not. Maybe just the normal disclosure that they make based on section 16.
Actual trading by insider.
By insider during those periods will tell us a lot about which of the alternative explanation has more power.
Merritt, could you say a bit more about the one takeaway at the end? You said that because fraud in the market, class actions might be more difficult in these crisis periods, that there should be ramped up public enforcement. But it seems like the possible takeaway of the empirics of your paper is that it's going to be equally difficult for public enforcement in times of crisis, precisely because when the tide goes out, maybe everybody looks bad, and you get to see parts of everyone that you would rather not see, and precisely because the updating of information in the crisis, unforeseen events, and I think we saw this in the government's response to the subprime crisis. It becomes everyone looks bad, and behavior that ex post we can say, we don't like that type of behavior, but given the uncertainties, the fact that these were risks that weren't anticipated, it becomes quite difficult to make a case against individuals. So I just wonder if you could say more about whether your empirics, do you agree with that assessment, or is there something different or special about public enforcement? I know that you don't have the fraud on the market issue, but would you agree that would be equally difficult for public enforcers to bring actions in times of crisis?
And just as a small, sort of anticipated my own question, and just to add on, not in a sense of adding for public enforcement, but maybe the explanation, well, let's just say you take an animal spirits explanation of this type of dynamic. Sort of the informational explanation as far as the greater value or sensitivity to information or uncertainty is one way of sort of making a more rational explanation of that. But let's just say you adopt, as some people have, a purely sort of irrational exuberance one way or another. This has led to the same types of critiques that we're seeing about post-crisis public regulation and the fact that public agencies, because they exist in the public, are overly sensitive to those already pre-existing animal spirit type dynamics, and this is why you get all the critiques of the regulatory response afterwards. But if you're moving then to an enforcement, then we can see why we've had these sort of, in the U.S., very controversial issues of how much enforcement should happen, what should be the types of prosecutions. So part of the takeaway could be the opposite, in that we should try to avoid public prosecutions in these contexts, simply because the ability of public agencies to respond rationally to the already uncertain and sometimes murky informational dynamics that investors were reacting to make it something that is even then exponentially more difficult to achieve as something that's going to yield consistently, coherent prosecutions.
So, Merritt, I like this paper very much. I think it's an important intervention. I want to suggest something in addition to the comments I've raised before in our private conversations. You give a number of explanations for why we continue to see persistent idiosyncratic risk during crises. And I wonder what you and your co-authors would think about the following. You might want to step back and just ask whether or not right now we have a good way to separate idiosyncratic and systematic risk in the financial models we use in the market. And the reason I'm asking that is because if you look in the financial literature right now, just the financial economics literature, there's a lot of debate over what's the right model. And every couple of years, a new financial economist gives us a new model that's supposed to be the next model that helps us isolate idiosyncratic risk. So for a while it was Fama-French, then it was Carhart, then people started liking Carhart. Now I think there's a 32-factor model that now seems to be the most popular, but people have problems with that model. They're fighting now. So for me, maybe we just lack a way to separate out these two things in a meaningful way. And by the way, I don't think that's a bad conclusion. I think that would be a very useful intervention. If that were true, it would help us for all the reasons you give in your implication section. And I'm not saying you have to say that here or assert that, but you could raise it as a possibility among your other explanations. The second thing I wanted to ask you about was whether you see a time trend here that's interesting. So I asked them to put back up your slide over time. And I see in this slide, so this is your upfront slide about the firm-specific risk over time. And I see three crises in the slide, right? I see the Great Depression and the associated market crash. I see the 99-2000 IPO bubble, and I see 2008. And what I see is in each case, I get the nice big jump in idiosyncratic vol, but the peak is falling over time. And I don't know whether that decrease is statistically interesting, but you can imagine a whole series of stories around the changes in the market over time and how the markets might be incorporating information, totally consistent with your explanations, that might suggest that over time the markets, this still persists, but it persists at a different level than it previously had. If so, that I think too would be a useful observation.
Well, thank you. These are really great comments, and I guess more than I can probably adequately respond to, but let me talk about a few things. One is going to Satiro's comments. This is a very interesting question. I think we have to separate out two issues. In the paper, when we talk about the use of event studies in association with insider trading, the question is using event studies to determine whether the information would be considered material or not. So the evidence has been, so we're starting with an assumption it's been proven that somebody has traded on non-public information, but is it material or not? And then test that question by seeing whether the jump in price is big enough when the company reveals that information. I think you're alluding to something that is prior to that in the prosecutorial or private litigation process, which is to try to figure out, was there somebody who was trading on non-public information? Are there some unusual trading patterns? And that's an interesting thing to pursue, to see how the technology that Zohar probably can tell us more about it than I understand, but the technologies that are used to scan trading patterns, more microstructure kinds of things, would be affected by these same issues. I find the Brazil data fascinating. And obviously it raises, and it connects, as Kate suggested, it connects at least somewhat with some of her comments. In some sense, if there's somehow contamination between the behavior that's occurring in the US markets and Brazil markets, when there's not so much reason to think that the underlying cash flows of future cash flows of Brazilian companies are so much in question, that really does raise some very fundamental questions about what we're seeing. I would wonder, though, whether there's a bias in terms of the public companies in Brazil, in terms of that they are export-oriented companies that might be affected much more by the U.S. financial crisis' effect on the global economy, so that the domestic Brazilian economy, weathered that storm pretty well, but I don't know how, specific export.
Let me just ask
yeah.
you something related to this specific topic. I could see that general volatility of sovereign bonds in Brazil has changed. So there was an improvement of volatility of Brazilian pounds. Well, there is no. It seems that if you're considering Brazil, so it's individual. It's not. It's something similar to idiosyncratic in one company. So we're talking about one country specifically. There is any kind of relation. But do you think that this change in volatility and the country rating or the country bonds would reflect in not in volatility in the market, but in idiosyncratic volatility, for example?
In terms of the Brazilian companies, or the Brazilian,
yes, Brazilian companies. So as the increase of Brazilian bonds volatility would.
I don't see why it would, unless I'm seeing
Yes,
this through
yes.
the prism of my own kind of analysis, but I don't see why it would, because it seems to me that's systematic risk for Brazilian. It would reflect systematic factors for Brazilian firms, unless there was something that, again, would suggest if volatility went down, that in fact, less structural changes within Brazilian industry. In terms of Kate's remarks, which I think to some extent built off of yours, it did occur to me, looking at these figures, so maybe this does say something more instead about investors rather than what's going on in terms of the sort of underlying predictability or unpredictability of the cash flows of individual issuers. What makes me somewhat skeptical of that, though, is I don't think that kind of the measures of market efficiency go down during this period of time. So if it sounds kind of like a story like investors are overreacting to information. And if they're overreacting to information, then we would expect to see kind of a reversions towards the mean. And I don't think we see that anymore in this era than in others. But I think that's something worth our looking at harder. Zohar, that's interesting about the insider trading. So if you saw there was an increase in trading by insiders, and I wouldn't be surprised if there was an increase in illegal trading by insiders, because what this analysis suggests is information is becoming more, what the insiders know when it's released will have a bigger influence on price, so more profit. Is that what you're suggesting, that if we saw an increase, then that would indicate that we're, kind of our explanation is right? Okay. Well, I mean, I think it's worth looking at. I'm concerned that, well, I guess the question would be whether 16A filings, which for those Brazilians that are not as familiar with every section of our Securities Act, are a requirement that insiders report within a couple of days after they engage in any purchase or sale of securities of their own firm. They report that to the SEC. Presumably, they tend to report the ones that they don't think are based on information sufficiently important that it would result in prosecution. So, which may be done through your brother-in-law or whatever. There may still be a correlation between insider trading that people are not afraid will be considered a 10b-5 violation, and insider trading that is. I'm not sure, but it's certainly worth a look. On the comments about public enforcement, I mean, I think you raise an interesting question that public enforcement could become less reliable because of a political environment after a crisis. Maybe that's simply then saying, I guess there's nothing we can do. Crises mean there's going to be less deterrence of making false statements, trading on insider information or whatever. I think all we were trying to suggest was if private enforcement becomes more difficult, and I think as long as private enforcement, as long as the courts require with private enforcers that event studies are used, which at least in the fraud and on the market area, I think it's really become the case, then the only way you're going to be able to prove that there's been a false statement or there's been trading on material inside information is to look at other factors suggesting materiality and other factors suggesting that the market didn't already know this news, and that we felt that those are more that those are easier to bamboozle a jury with, in essence, than prosecutorial authorities who can at least exercise some prosecutorial discretion. So that, I mean, one response would be make it easier to introduce this other kind of evidence in private suits as well, but we're more concerned about what the effects of that would be with private suits than public suits. That's probably a different question from the one you address, although what Curtis and Jed addressed, I guess, also goes to maybe the other half of our implication, which is, hey, we know private suits are going to be harder at least as long as courts keep insisting on event studies being used to prove loss causation and materiality. So this is a time in which we're going to have to put more resources into public enforcement. Maybe you're saying, well, that's dangerous too, or maybe public enforcers are already going to be out there and fierce or whatever. I'd have to think through that more. But thank you for all these comments.